Okay, I guess I'm going to get started into the introductory section again. Thanks for joining us this morning. So I want to spend some time talking about, we're at sort of at the midway point of the second phase of this these set of projects that are sponsored and supported by New York Department of Environmental Conservation, Long Island Sound Study, and NEIWPCC. So we're going to present some of the results of where we are so far and talk about how we plan to move forward with this. So just as a couple of disclaimers, this is the EPA funded project, and NEIWPCC also assists in providing the funding and in partnership with the Long Island Sound Study, but we're not necessarily speaking about policies of EPA, NEIWPCC, or lists here. And also, as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, just in case people are interested in this topic and they want to come in later and view it. We'll make that available probably in a week or so, at the end of this week, I would say. So my name is Jonathan Clow. I'm a environmental consultant out of Central Vermont in a very tiny company, and have been working with sea level rise modeling and their impact on marshes since the late 1990s. And as I will explain in a moment, Vicki O'Neill sort of was the person who conceptualized this project and helped get it started. She's on leave now, so I'm being assisted by our panelists who can introduce themselves. Angela, you want to go first?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I recognize a lot of the names. I'm Angela Skavitzy. I work for the New York State DEC here in Region 3 in the Bureau of Marine Habitat. And part of Region 3 is Westchester, Long Island Sound. So any project proposals in Westchester, Long Island Sound, in tidal wetlands, I review. That's it.
Ready for me to go next?
Sure.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Powell. I am the Sustainable and Resilient Communities Extension Professional for Westchester County. I work for New York Sea Grant and the Long Island Sound Study. And I am responsible for working with coastal Long Island Sound communities here in Westchester County to help them advance sustainability and resiliency projects.
Thanks. Thanks to both of you, and I really appreciate your help with this conversation that we're having today. And so just what I had said previously, we want to hear your voices as well. And so what I did was I basically allowed everybody to talk. So, but you have to unmute yourself. So if you have something to speak up or you have a question, would love to hear from you in the chat. You can ask a question and we'll monitor that. Or you can raise your hand and I can call on you that way. Or there'll be pauses for questions and feel free to just speak up. Hoping to have this be a two-way conversation as opposed to just a one-way conversation, which sometimes happens with Zoom meetings. Get into a stupor, especially Zoom plus PowerPoint. That's a dangerous combination. But so all right. So basically, this presentation, I'm going to just start by giving a project overview about what we've been working on and the history of it. Talk a little bit about one of the products. So this is kind of a two-part presentation. One is to present. Thank you also for answering the introductory poll, and would be very happy if you were willing to introduce yourself in the chat as well. And so, which I need to bring up so I can see. So give me a moment while I bring up that in another window. Okay. Anyway, so this is a two-part presentation. The first part is showing where we are in the process, and then the second part is sort of a discussion about how we can leverage the work we've done so far in terms of creating local conservation plans that have an impact on communities and planning going forward, and marsh resiliency. So to start with, the project has two. The primary project purpose is to provide information for Long Island Sound Study municipalities and conservation groups and local governments to develop marsh conservation plans that can improve coastal resiliency. And so this is the second phase of a two-part project. We had done a couple of these marsh conservation plans previously. One was Westchester County specific and went more for breadth. But so the stages of the project are to take some existing model simulations that we have based on the sea level affecting marshes model. And in the red is the stuff that we've kind of already done. Take some of those model results and make them available online. And also to extend those in a data analysis that looks specifically on a tax parcel by tax parcel basis. So that just to assist with planning, where are these marsh expansions or current marshes? Are they currently on public or private land, et cetera? And right now we're at this third bullet, which is to present what we've done with the viewer and the data analysis results. And then through the end of May, we're going to be working with local conservation stakeholder groups and developing marsh conservation plans. And finally, in June, we'll be participating in some community workshops to roll out these conservation plans and then also to revise them based on the feedback that we get from the community. And we already went through this whole process once, and this is our second time through. And we've really significantly expanded what's in the viewer. So for many of you, I imagine this is a question that we don't need to spend too much time thinking about, which is what are the benefits of coastal marshes, and they are quite varied and significant. One of the most significant is that just the habitat powerhouse the coastal marshes are in terms of invertebrates, which then pass through the food web up to the more charismatic species, game fish, osprey, etc. And so they really have a tremendous amount of ecological productivity. But there are also human-centered benefits, which I think are still being studied and quantified, but there are a number of studies that show that marshes have a significant benefit in terms of wave attenuation, reducing the height of waves during storm events, and also erosion control, maintaining shorelines during storm events and just coastal shorelines in general. There's also benefits of carbon and nutrient sequestration. And another one that is a little bit more generalized is just this sense of place that you get being in a community with a marsh versus being in a community with, say, vertical seawalls, for example. So I'm just going to try to activate another poll here if I can get this to stay in front. Polls. Okay, I'm just going to end the first one. I guess I have to end the first one in order to start the second one. So the thing that I wanted to talk to the group about in terms of getting this conversation started are which ecosystem services would be most important to emphasize in marsh conservation planning, and what would be and so this is sort of two senses, like which ecosystem services are most important overall, as well as what will be the most beneficial in terms of getting marsh conservation planning, in terms of politically moving people and getting marsh conservation moving forward. And we discussed a number of those ecosystem services, but there also could be some that we're missing. But I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about where we should go as we move forward and think about this and present current and future marsh footprints to the public. What will be should we focus on all of these sort of with equal breadth, or is there something more in particular? I don't know, Sarah or Angela, if you have any thoughts on this question.
I actually was just putting a note in the chat to everybody. I feel we've had a couple more folks come in, so please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And Jonathan has given folks the ability to unmute if you want to chime in.
Yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate that. Sorry, I put you
Sure.
on the spot when you're doing some background mechanics on the. So I appreciate that.
No problem. And I see Nancy has her hand up. So Nancy, are you able to unmute or?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, perfect. There you are. Yep.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Nancy Seligson. I'm the co-chair of the Long Island Sound Study Citizens Advisory Committee and former supervisor of the town of Mamaroneck. So I represent the town of Mamaroneck on the CAC. And from a municipal standpoint, I have to say that emphasizing the flood protection provided by marshes would be the most important aspect for those who are in elected office in the town of Mamaroneck, as well as recreation opportunities and community character, because those are things that really, I think, resonate the most at this point in time with them.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. I noticed I think I can share, see if I can figure out how to share the results of this poll. I see end poll. Let's try end poll and then share results. I don't know how that looks, where that exactly looks, but
Yeah, that works. I see it.
okay, good. Yeah, so what you're saying, I think, is reflected by a lot of the people that are here in terms of flood protection and wave attenuation being one of the most important things that's out there. So that's interesting, and I think that's something that we can carry forward as we think about this. And the structure of a marsh conservation report, as well as the kind of additional research that we do as we develop that. So thanks for that feedback. Does anybody else have something that they want to say on this?
Just noting, I don't know if you see in the chat, a lot of agreement with Nancy, flood protection, wave attenuation, and another coastal community here in Westchester. So yeah, a lot of agreement in the chat.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. And the good, one of the good news about that is that's, a lot of these ecosystem services have literature support for them, but there's been a lot of study of this, and there's been some modeling work done and some examination of, say, post aftermath of Superstorm Sandy in terms of shorelines that did and did not have marshes adjacent and their impact. So I think this is it's an area that's being studied and can be emphasized, and we can educate about. So thanks.
And Jonathan, just to chime in a little bit, I know we were talking beforehand. I'm happy to see in the participant list here some of the more local municipality representatives, because in the previous county marsh plan, it was really broad and general. And one of the things that I thought would be the most beneficial in marsh conservation planning as things move forward is to get more local municipalities, towns, villages involved on a slightly smaller scale than the county, because they really have the most impact when it comes to things like planning and zoning board. And and to echo what was said earlier, a lot of communities in Westchester particularly are dealing with a lot of flood issues, and that's a top priority for them too. So the local municipalities are really going to be the place that we should try to focus a lot of our energy and get input from.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so I want to, I don't know what this is covering the rest of the, it's covering my slideshow, so I'll move it over. But so right, so there are some example marsh conservation plans from the previous project, and Sarah or Angela, one of you can put some of these two URLs into the chat. I should probably have assigned one of you. Sorry about that. Signing both of you is complicated. But so we did, so one of these was for Mattatuck Creek in Mattatuck, New York. But then, and so in this one, it was a single marsh system that we were looking at, and therefore we went fairly into depth in terms of what the ecological characteristics are, specifics about that marsh. When we worked with the Westchester stakeholders as part of that first plan, the interest at that time was to go broad and to look at some of look at across all of these 6 named marsh systems, and to create a plan for that. Many of you have probably seen this, and in fact, interesting, I didn't actually have a chance to look at the first poll to see what let me see if I can look at the first poll to see how many people were familiar with that. So about 2/3 of you who are on this call were familiar with the viewer and that plan coming into this. So I think that is, I'm glad to hear that. And so that means hopefully we can get some feedback from you about what were your impressions of it? Where can we go deeper? Because we have sort of funding to go in for another round here. Would it make sense to are there areas that we missed? Do we continue on a breadth standpoint? So I'd like you to think about that, because we're going to talk about brainstorming a little bit later, brainstorming what the next steps can be for Westchester County and also for New York City. If there's interest in expanding it, so that could be another possibility, would be to expand to do a similar kind of plan that we did for Westchester for the defined New York City marshes, or to go in specific on that. I'm focusing on Westchester to some extent because the majority of people that are here are Westchester focused. It seems like from that first poll, about 2/3 of you are from Westchester, but that doesn't mean New York City folks shouldn't speak up. And even Suffolk County. It can be a general communication. So again, just getting into the timeline, it's a little bit quick in terms of what we pulled together through the end of May, and the way that I'll discuss this later, but we sort of have 3 working groups, and then a lot of data gathering and emailing in between that. So basically 3 monthly meetings in which the plan is developed, put together, and reviewed. And then in June, the community workshops. So previously, what we had done in terms of what Vicki and I had worked on in terms of, just trying to move, I have a lot of windows on my other monitor and they're all over my notes. There we go. But previously, what Vicki and I had done was to really try to identify what were quote unquote the most significant marsh complexes in the Long Island Sound portion of New York State, and identify them across counties. And look at unfragmented tidal wetland complexes. So this is kind of the biggest marshes that currently exist. And, we had Marshlands Conservancy for Westchester, but that was it for Westchester County. And so one of the things to point out is that even though we've expanded this significantly, so we expanded it now to, we've more than tripled the number of marshes. Now we're up to 67 marshes in the system. So incorporating a lot of these smaller marshes, and also incorporating places where there's low-lying land that could have marshes in the future. But the point that I wanted to make is that even though we've expanded this, and I think we've gotten a lot of the significant marsh systems, it does not necessarily mean that if your marsh system was not included there that, or an area that you're interested in is not included there, that we can't continue to develop that, because we have continuous model results for all of coastal Long Island Sound. And so the first project was an example of that. Now, when you get out to Suffolk County, the current and future marshlands are a little more sparse for a variety of reasons, combination of the elevation of the land, and probably the substrate to some extent, but we do go all the way out to Fisher's Island. And so one of the basic pieces here are these model where we work on characterizing what sea level rise, the impact sea level rise could have on the current, on where marshes are located, and whether they're whether they are predicted to remain in their location, or whether they will expand or migrate, or there'll be just general loss. And so that process, to a certain extent, is somewhat similar, because if you look at this, you have a relationship where you already have a relationship which we can look in the historic records at where the past sea levels were and the current sea levels are, and see how marshes have moved. And then in the future sea level rise, you can sort of do an extrapolation across the shoreline and see where marshes could be. The complexity, however, as you notice, is this is not a strictly a bathtub model. As the sea level rises, as the sea levels change, also the bathymetry of the shoreline changes, because marshes will trap sediments, a lot of complex things that go on. And so in these modeling, we do work to incorporate the dynamics of marshes under sea level rise, such as the fact that as you get sort of additional flooding, you get more sediment is trapped, you get more above ground plant growth. You can potentially lose some of your root matter because you have so much above ground plant growth occurring. You have some below ground processes, organic matter decay and the like, which causes compaction. You have changes in salinity. So the way that our model works is that it takes into account all of these processes, however, in a relatively simple manner. It's not sort of tracking each particle of dirt and seeing how it moves around and tracking sediment expansion, but rather it's tracking the potential changes in elevation of these lands, taking into account these processes, our best estimate of what they are, but also our uncertainty over those processes. So it takes into account uncertainty more than it takes into account complexity, kind of putting error. It's more of an empirical model with error bars around it. Some other considerations are just the surrounding elevation of lands, the vertical relief. And I think this is part of what you're seeing in terms of steep terrain is why when you look out in Suffolk County that you see less capability for marsh migration in some locations there, just because there's a lot of vertical relief already, and maybe so vertical, there's not a lot of marsh habitat there to begin with. Also, the model does take into account where land is developed and undeveloped, and where you're just going to get flooded infrastructure versus potential for marsh habitat unless you do some sort of significant restoration, as well as it takes, to the extent that we have them, it takes into account vertical seawall development, the National Levee Database and local data sources as well. The National Wetland Inventory even has some information about where locations are impounded and where they're not. So I don't know if, I'll just take a pause. This is a reminder more for me to just see if anybody's got their hand raised or anybody has any comments. I see Ann Henderson's hand is up, but I think that's been up since the beginning. So I might lower it unless you have a specific question. Okay, so moving along here, the model that we used is called SLAM, which some of you might be familiar with because it has been used quite a lot by policymakers. It was developed by EPA and it's been used by USGS and also the Nature Conservancy and the National Wildlife Federation. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service used it to model the impact of sea level rise on all of their coastal refuges. over the last 20 years. And as I was saying before, it simulates all the dominant processes in wetland conversions, but some of it is, a lot of it is not mechanistic. It does that in a simple way. But it has some complexity in terms of the number of land cover types that it incorporates, because it's been applied so widely, and some of those are not relevant. Just going back to the model history, I can't talk about SLAM without talking about my close colleague, the late Dick Park, his good friend, and he started working with us back in 1986. Some pretty good foresight. There was a report to Congress in 1991. And as you can see, it was pretty rudimentary as computers were, sort of just using very blocky input-output. And it used 500-meter cell sizes. Right now, we're modeling all of coastal New York with 5-meter cell sizes. So computers have come a long way. I got involved with it in the late 1990s and really got involved with it. The thing that really breathed life back into the model was an EPA STAR grant in the mid-2000s, where we had a new team of scientists come in and look at the underlying science and sort of develop the model where it needed to be developed. And the basic concept of the model is that the marshes will come to, marsh habitat will come to equilibrium with where the sea level rise is. And we see this relationship between the salt marsh and the irregularly flooded marsh and the upland and this relationship to the tide range. And we've looked at thousands of sites across the country, and this relationship is ubiquitous. And when we find this relationship not falling into place, we almost always find issues. Well, okay, well, there's a sea level rise occurring there. There's there's some sort of tide range change, so we can usually come across the reason for that. Now, on the other hand, this might mean that future model results under sea level rise are overly optimistic, because it assumes that you're going to be able to come to the marshes are going to be able to migrate fast enough. And if sea level rise becomes truly rapid at the end of the century, that assumption may be significantly tested. And this just shows how as you move on, you get your migration occurring. Tracy, did you have a question?
Not necessarily. I just I'm looking at
Unfortunately,
how.
I'm not hearing you. I don't know if anybody else is. I see you're unmuted.
I can hear her.
You can hear me?
I can hear you, Tracy. Yeah, if you want to, I can relay. I'm assuming you can hear me, Jonathan. I can relay your question or comment.
Sure.
Okay,
It's basically
you can unless anybody else is hearing, then you can type your question into the chat. I know that you're unmuted, but maybe your local machine is muted or something else is going on. But
And Jonathan, can you hear me?
well, I can't actually. Maybe that's my fault.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on a moment. I guess maybe I'm the only one who can't hear. Hopefully, there have been a lot of questions here. Try to resolve this issue. Okay, I heard something there.
hello.
Yes, I can hear now.
So there we
Okay.
go. Yeah, I think we could all hear and you couldn't hear us.
That was weird because I didn't change a thing on my end. So some sort of an internet glitch, and I apologize about that. Hopefully you could hear me while I was giving the presentation. But anyway, yes, please go on.
Just issues that we're dealing with in Rye are that on one side of Milton Harbor, we do have the beautiful marshlands. On the other side, we have the developed Milton Point, and many of the homes that are on Milton Point already have seawalls and piers and things, and eventually they need to be redone. So the question is, how can we educate homeowners of the different options when they want to redo their seawall? Because we're in the process of doing one right now, and we're trying to encourage a living shoreline, but we're getting pushback from the homeowner and the engineer that's working with the homeowner. So we need better tools to try to suggest more living shoreline options.
Yes. thank you.
Otherwise, they're just going to build another seawall, and you won't be able to the vegetation won't be able to move anywhere because the seawall will be in place. So it's just how do you convince a homeowner to consider a living shoreline when they already have a seawall, or when it's time for them to repair their seawall?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, and something that I think could be a focus of this plan. And it was a little bit of a focus of the previous plan, and the fact that we did have one case study in terms of marsh conservation planning about a landowner who's replacing 100-year-old seawall with a living shoreline. And so, one thing we could do is we could update this a little bit further, because this was sort of early in the process.
Yeah, I've
putting this
seen
together.
those examples, and they're amazing.
Right.
But I don't think most homeowners are like that. They
Oh,
just want,
right. They may not have that, or they may not have the resources or yes, or the interest. Well, I mean, yeah, I feel like it's a really interesting question. I think it's there's probably a
we're-
combination of education is probably you said that word earlier, how can you educate? And I think that's going to be, to the extent that a plan like this or calling out case studies like this can be an education and showing beautiful results, showing what it looked like before and what it should look like after, and having it be something that is feels more natural, more visual appealing, and yet has worked for erosion control and for flood control. That would be super powerful. So hopefully some of these people that are getting started with these nature-based shoreline will be willing to demonstrate that. And then I think this is something that, as we work together in this group, that we can think about, like, is there something that can be done to on the government level to
yes.
so the carrot to help, whether it be some sort of tax implications or other kind of implications in terms of other kind of incentives to get landowners to do this, where we can, how that can be put together. And there's I don't know if there are more government funds have been available, at least recently, in terms of ARPA funds and things like that. So some brainstorming about that, I think would be really warranted. Thanks for the question.
Jonathan, I can add a little bit to that as well. And also like to point out that Katie Friedman is writing a little bit in the chat here. But when we're looking at all the seawalls and places like Westchester County, which do have a lot of hardened shoreline, it is a very difficult conversation to have with landowners, and it's site by site basis, which makes it even more difficult. So each property might have different needs, and as the marine habitat biologist in region who is reviewing the seawall applications, I understand exactly what you're saying. And I think it comes down to, there's like a few different things that we might have to strategize, and I've brought this up before, but when we're looking at individual homeowners and seawalls that are running in line across numerous properties, that's one obstacle. Looking at local coding and like within the building and planning department could be another aspect that might need, like what's the local code saying, what's the local laws regs saying about replacements and where you can replace them. And we could have a whole conversation about this, so feel free to contact me, because I don't want to hijack this, but this is a frequent problem at Westchester County specifically. So I understand where you're coming from, and feel free to reach out to me. I could put my email in the chat, but yeah, I just wanted to chime in because I experienced that too, and that is one of my concerns as well, is how do I approach landowners to really get them to at least think about and look at alternatives to a vertical wall in hopes that we can save some space for tidal migration. So sorry,
Yeah.
I hijacked that a little bit,
No,
but
that wasn't a hijack at all. I appreciate
No.
it.
I just wanted to like chime in and say that I understand completely where Tracy's coming from, and that kind of that there's a lot of, each site's so specific and there's a lot of different wants and needs from everyone, so it can get a little bit daunting, and if you want to have a private chat about that with the community of Rye and maybe our marine habitat staff here in region, that'd be great.
No, I'd love to have a side conversation with you about that. Another suggestion maybe, I mean, there aren't that many engineering firms that work with property owners. And I don't know if there's some kind of forum that you could have to talk with the engineering firms that are building the seawalls, that, to give the property owners these types of options, because by the time we get a wetland permit, the plans are all down, and we will suggest living shorelines, but we get pushback
From the engineer.
And
Yeah.
sometimes they even say, well, DC said we don't have to do this, or they said it's fine, so but again, I don't want to take any more time about
No,
this, but
I think
that's what my concerns are, and we're in the front line. We're pushing it, and we're trying to encourage this because we know what's going to happen with sea level rise, but to reach the property owner ahead of time is I need some tools.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, that's super helpful. I appreciate the feedback from both of you. Thank you. So yeah, right. And so the uptake on this model is that it is its simplicity is it's a sort of a strength and a weakness, because it lets us bring in more complexity and the uncertainty around that, which I can get to later if it seems like a reasonable thing to discuss. I have some slides on that, but I don't want to belabor the point on that right now. But I do want to talk a little bit about the what the Marsh Interactive Fate Viewer is, and so basically what the history of this project is that there was a NYSERDA project in 2014 where they said, well, let's look at the impact of sea level rise on coastal New York State. But they excluded Westchester County because the data weren't great there at that time. And then there was a LIST project which extended those results to Westchester County. So all of a sudden we had results for really all of coastal New York. Following up on that, in 2017, a project was completed, again funded by NYSERDA, which tuned up all of the model results using updated data sets. But it also did a bunch of other sort of bells and whistles on there, like sort of some simple models of adaptation strategies. What happens if you put thin layer deposition on this model? What are the costs of letting marsh retreat versus marsh restoration, and what are the benefits? And finally, that project also examined the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge on roads and infrastructure in coastal New York. So sort of a simple screening stage model to look at where storms might regularly and where tides might regularly inundate roads and various infrastructure. So Vicky, seeing all these model results, however, they're all kind of like lost. They're all kind of in the scientific literature. There's a couple publications. There is a lot of GIS results and technical reports, but wanting to bring some of these, the data that we had, the model results, into the planning domain. And so her idea was to create a simple web viewer that simplified the results to some extent, that looked on them sort of on a marsh by marsh basis. So sort of defining individual marshes and looking at what's going to happen in this location specifically. And then also by bringing the tax parcel data in place. And that's how we produce this Marsh Interactive Fate Viewer. And as I was saying, the history of SLAM means that there's a lot of complexity, some of which just is not relevant for it might be relevant for certain types of policymakers, might be relevant like the cypress swamp category, not super relevant. And so there was a simplification that Ducks Unlimited helped us put together, where we just look at these simplified land cover types. So we have, and this is where we're going to be looking at these model results. You're going to have this low tidal, which is a non-vegetated tidal flat that is visible at low tide. Then you have a low marsh, which usually exists right about the mean tide level line. So something that is in the intercoastal zone, but is exposed at least as often as it is covered with salt water. And the high marsh is this blue color. So you have sort of a salt marsh and a brackish marsh category. The other thing that we track is where we have developed dry land, which is defined by a % impervious data layer. Where it's dry land, it's been developed, so it either has a road or a building on it, where that is to be flooded as well, which can be an impediment, as we've been discussing, to marsh migration, of course. And then we took the sea level rise scenarios that we looked at range for, so there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what's going to happen still with sea level rise scenarios. And we're using the 2016 New York Governor's Office sea level rise scenarios for planning. We did look at the, recently I looked at the 2022 NOAA scenarios that have been updated. And the sort of the final point about where you get, which is ranging from about 15 inches to about 75 inches. So from about 0.4 meters to nearly 2 meters, almost 6 feet of sea level rise. The uncertainty range in the NOAA scenarios is still pretty much consistent with that. There's a little bit of refinement in terms of how they, how you get there. The NOAA curves tend to be steeper in the second half of the steeper in the second half of the century. But basically that same degree of uncertainty exists, and there's a lot of functions, a lot of reasons for that, going from sort of how the ice sheets are going to dynamically react to just how much greenhouse gases there are going to be in the atmosphere as well, and human response to sea level rise. There's another, so that's also consistent with this climate report from 2013, which also gave us some sense of the uncertainty. And so this is when we run the model on uncertainty analysis, we sample from a sea level rise distribution that ranges from, again, about 0.4 to, in this case, a little over 2 meters. And that was derived by fitting their confidence intervals to this distribution. So the low scenario is considered at least pretty unlikely to occur, really a best case scenario. The medium scenario is pretty close to the most likely, which would be 1 meter by 2100. So that might be a good one to use for planning. And the high scenario is close to the worst case scenario of about 2 meters. And as you look at the viewer, you also see that for every one of these 67 named marsh systems, there are fact sheets that provide an overview of the site, in terms of what currently is there, what's predicted to be there under sea level rise, and the resilience of what's currently there. And so we look at that in a number of ways. We produce some maps, which was I was showing you with these broad ecosystem categories of unvegetated, low tidal, low marsh, high marsh. So you can see in this location, you've got a lot of high marsh. And in fact, that's one benefit of New York coastline, is that there is a lot of marsh that falls into this high marsh category. It's categorized as irregularly flooded by the National Wetland Inventory. It also has elevations that are high. And what that is called is, what people call that is marsh elevation capital, meaning that the marsh has to sink a pretty long distance prior to it being not a viable marsh habitat. Now, in that process, it gets flooded more frequently. It could get more saline, so it does need to be managed during that process. And we've seen a lot of marsh loss even under low sea level rise. But that's just a characteristic that is a benefit for New York State. But then also we look at, so this is in the future where marsh, if you allowed marsh habitat to migrate, where it would be likely to migrate to, given all of the uncertainties in the model, including the very important sea level rise one. And so you can see that this area in the center of this, I think this Frost Creek, there is a golf course, which something's going to happen there. Either there's going to be a seawall developed, or there's by the end of the century, there's a 80 to 90% likelihood that it's going to be inundated more regularly enough to convert to a marsh. So these are kind of information you can get from these fact sheets. And then we also have it summarized in table format, where you look at the fate of existing marsh area. And it's broken down by whether it's on public or private land. So in this case, we have because of the marsh elevation capital I was talking about, this is all high marsh, that it has the potential to maintain itself under 2055, under pretty much all of the sea level rise scenarios. But the expected value, which is basically the sum of all the uncertainty analysis results. So if you had like 1,000 equally likely scenarios, you kind of add all those up and multiply each of those by 1,000th. Anyway, it shows that by 2100, you still are only losing 13 acres at this site in public land and 3 acres on private land. On the other hand, the potential for new marsh is greater on private land. The location where marsh might migrate to. And this is what this average new marsh in undeveloped land. And it also looks at potential new marsh in developed dry land, which would obviously require some work to have viable marsh there. So it's just kind of informational, but it does give you some information that there's some potential for some acres of loss of development. And overall, the results at this site, if you look at the total potential marsh areas, I think the potential is a key word here, but as you can see the marsh land acres potentially going up, but that doesn't take into account the fact that in order for this new marsh to migrate, you're going to need some public policy or just basically allowing that to occur. So I see a question from Tracy about invasive vegetation and what percentage of the marshes have that. That's a good question, and I think that's something where the model that we're using is, as with these fairly broad categories of low marsh and high marsh, it kind of at least in terms of the model results, it's looking at potential marsh habitat, and it's not necessarily looking at what is invasive and what is so I think as you get more perturbation and you get more salinity occurring in some of these historical marshes, then you tend to get additional invasive species being incorporated in that. So that's part of the reason why I say that these model results are kind of optimistic. As you'll be seeing that way. There's a lot of information you can get from them in terms of, should I give up on this marshland? No, because there's a really high probability it's going to still be marshland, but that does not take into account the fact that this area might need to be, might need some, a lot of management for invasives, for example. And there's also a case study in that about managing invasive species in the plan that we'd sent around for Westchester County. All right, so that basically is an overview of what the viewer looks like, and I'm gonna drive it in just a minute to give an example of how it works. Unless we have someone else has additional questions at this time. So, so the viewer itself when you bring it up, you click through the disclaimer after thoroughly reading it and incorporating it into your thinking. And then so you can see you've got the 67 marsh locations are shown here. And if you hover, you can get the name of it if you're interested in one in particular. Then you can focus in on, say, New York City sites. Or you can, it's a web-GIS that's fairly quick, written on something, just allowing some people to talk. You can drag to pan, you can zoom in and out with the zoom buttons here. But if you find the site that you're interested in, you can also use the mouse wheel to scroll, and it'll take a look at Ferry Point Park, for example, here. So if I click on Ferry Point Park in New York, it starts to bring up some marsh results for this. Now, one of the things, because this was designed, part of what makes this a lightweight web-GIS and load pretty quickly in most counts is the fact that it really is only showing one marsh system at a time. So if you want to look over at these other marsh systems, then you have to scroll over there and that becomes populated. So if you have any issues with my results aren't showing, just try scrolling a little bit. And when you're in on a site like this, you can also get access to the fact sheet. And you can click on the fact sheet and it will bring up the 2 pages of background and then 2 pages I've already just discussed. So the first thing it brings up is a probability map in the year 2100. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn off the overlay for a minute. Down here gives you some information about whether you want to go between, and I'm sorry, to the upper right of the screen, but below, in the second box down, you have some probability, some capability to move between different types of maps. So you can look at a probability map, which I was just discussing. You can look at the marsh types and you can look at no overlay. So if I go back to no overlay, you get a sense of the tax parcels that are there. And we have them coded by color in blue and black, blue being public land and black being private land. And if you click on a particular tax parcel, you get information about who the owner is. And you also get the same table that we show in the fact sheet showing the fate of current and new marshlands and what the possibilities are. So in this very large site owned by Parks and Rec, there's currently 6 acres, has the potential to expand to 15 acres by 2055. And on average, if marsh was allowed to expand, you have over 50 acres of potential habitat at this location. And then sometimes you can also change the background map. You can look at satellite imagery if you want to see what it looks like. Clicking on another site just to get that to stop being yellow. You can look at a black and white imagery, which can be very useful for really making the public to private interface more clear. So let me look at the marsh type map now. And you have, when you click on the marsh type or the probability, you get these sliders to the lower left of the screen. And I'm going to bring it back down to the year 2008. So this was the year of the National Wetland Inventory data that this is based on. And you can see that there's not a huge amount of marsh habitat here, but there is some. If you zoom in on it a little bit, you can see you got some marsh habitat coming in here. If I turn off the overlay and turn on the imagery, you get a sense of what that high marsh looks like on the satellite imagery and what is adjoining it. Going back to the marsh type map here, you can then either look at a low, a medium, or a high sea level rise scenario associated with that. And the low sea level rise being about 0.4 meters by 2100. The the medium being almost 1 meter by 2100 and the high being 190. So the low sea level rise scenario, obviously the best case scenario, I think it's not that much higher than what we've seen historically. And if you look at, you can then move across these, move across this timeline and see what the impacts would be under a low sea level rise scenario. So oftentimes under a low sea level rise scenario, what you're going to see is the existing marsh is going to be fine, but there's going to be some expansion of marsh into dry lands potentially, which makes sense because the existing marsh is continuing to gain elevation due to a process called accretion. But the dry land does not being flooded regularly enough to gain elevation. So to a certain extent, the marsh can successfully expand. You can see this area here, you have this area was defined as impervious. So you have some flooded developed area. If you look at that same scenario under medium, in this location, there's a lot of low-lying land in this park. So you have a fair expansion, especially down south here. You have a fair degree of expansion of potential marsh. So these areas are highly flooded, so would have the potential to be marshlands. And if you look at it under the high sea level rise scenario, which is close to the worst case scenario, then you get even more significant expansion of marshlands through the area. And so I think, one of the interesting points here is you can see as you get to the high sea level rise scenario, you have a lot of developed land that is being flooded. And so this kind of can lead to some public policy questions like, so if you are going to protect that developed land in those roads, where, in what type, would you do a natural shoreline type of enhancement of slope, or where would you do the vertical seawall? You have a potential to be a tremendous amount of marshland there under some circumstances. And then, there's quite a bit of, under the worst case scenario, quite a bit of flooding. You can also take a look at the impact on developed lands as well. So I think I covered, so the probability map, if you look at the probability map, it's giving you a probability of where marsh might be. And it's a simpler map. And it takes into account all the sea level rise, the sort of expected value of what these cells might be under all the different sea level rise scenarios. So if you look at it in 2008, it says even because there's some uncertainty in what the tide range is, we did not have a tide gauge right at this location. We allowed that tide range to vary. That also varies into the future. I think we know for sure that some of these areas are not marshes. So you can see these really light blue colors saying that there's a very low probability of marsh there. And I think that they should be interpreted as a very low likelihood in the future as well. When you start getting into the purple colors, that's moderate likelihood, and the red colors are really high likelihood. But as you expand to the year 2100, so you can see that these areas that are red really have a high likelihood of just getting flooded frequently, regardless of what our assumptions are in the model about accretion rates, about sea level rise scenarios. They're pretty much always going to be a potential marsh habitat there. The areas in light blue, kind of worst case scenario, and the areas in purple are somewhere in the middle. The other point is that this probability map does not take into account the development. So if I go back to the marsh type, you can see that gives you a much different picture about where marsh may or may not be, because you have where areas are currently impervious. So that is pretty much the quick tour. The few things over here on the left, the legend changes based on what you select. So, jumps back and forth. You can get some definitions. The fact sheets I already discussed. Sometimes if you were looking at the tax boundaries, the colors just get confusing because especially if you're looking at a probability map, which includes blue, and then you color the color the tax parcels blue, then you have trouble seeing that. So you can get rid of the colors. There's a help file you can go through that'll help you through basically all the functionality of the viewer. Okay, so that is the overview of the viewer. Now, many of you probably received this a hands-on training that I emailed to people who had registered prior to yesterday. But on the other hand, the information is all here. And so I'm going to take 5 minutes and allow you to go through the viewer and use it just for a moment. And answer some of the questions that are on the next slide. So to start, you navigate to the wetland viewer, go to Westchester County sites and Pine Brook. So I'll just go ahead and do that here. So you start at the viewer, get the disclaimer, click through that. Then you up in the upper part here, you have some options about where to show. So we're going to look at a Westchester County site. So let's look at Westchester County sites, and it zooms in on those. And then click on Pine Brook to bring up those data and those results. Then to follow on to these navigation steps and questions, just to make sure you're comfortable with the interface and see if you have any questions about it. So I'm going to take 5 for a minute, and hopefully you're interested in spending a little bit of time clicking through this. We'll reconvene in 5 minutes. Well, okay, thanks for sticking with us through that exercise. I guess the first question I have is, did anybody have any difficulty? There's still an opportunity for us to make revisions to the viewer based on user feedback. And so if you have any difficulties or not, it's been, now that this is phase 2 of the project, it's hopefully been pretty heavily user tested. During phase 1 of the process, we went through some beta testing and incorporated comments, but I'd still be interested. But if no one has any specific comments about the mechanics, I guess I would like to hear what, if you have any feedback in terms of this site, what the implications are, and the fact sheet, et cetera. I see Tracy's raising your hand. Go ahead. Oh, wait, there's maybe multiple people raising their hands.
Hi, in the key, the probability of marsh key, it has the numbers, but it doesn't, I think before you said meters, but there's no indication of the measurement. That I see on the key.
Right.
10 to 20 what? Inches, feet, meters?
Oh, yes. Okay, good. That's good. Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think I can
Just
add those
because
right.
you told us, but it's for everybody to take a look at, and
right,
people
right.
that don't have a good understanding of this. So you really need to be clear.
Yeah, right. And so in this case, what that actually is like a likelihood. It's a percentage. So if you look
okay.
at the
So
current,
so it's a percentage.
so it's different.
So
it changes when you go from marsh type, to the probability, because the marsh type does include these meters of like low, medium, and high sea level rise scenarios. It includes those. And when you go to the probability, it's the it's the likelihood. And so that's why when you look at the current data, the year 2003, the areas where you have marsh in the NWI are areas which are the most probable to have marsh. And these light blue colors are probably like a tiny percentage chance that we're wrong on the tide and there's marsh there. But the truth is, if you look at the satellite imagery, those are very low probabilities. So the NWI pretty much gets it right. And as you, but because it doesn't have meters in it, because when you look at, say, the year 2055, you are looking at all of the possible sea level rise for 2055. That's one of the uncertainty parameters. So this is in 2055. Our best estimate is that, in this location down here, it's about 50% chance likely to be flooded regularly enough to have marshes. And that's based on what we know about the sea level rise, what might happen, the uncertainty in our current land elevation, all the factors that we have in the model that we can assign uncertainty distributions to. So yeah, that's a really good question. I appreciate that. Isabel, you had a question as well?
Sure. I was just wondering why, as you kind of play around with this, some of the data seems to fall outside of what's characterized as the parcels.
Yeah, that's a good question. So right, so we started with when I worked with Vicky, I started with these definition of where the marshes are and where the surrounded land areas are. And so we defined these polygons for these marsh areas. And so when you click in and you get the model results, the tax parcels that we defined were those that were both in this polygon, but also had some probability of marsh. So these are areas up here are in the polygon, but they don't have any, they're really up high enough that by the year 2100, they're not going to get flooded enough to have a high marsh habitat potentially be located on them, even under the worst case scenario. However, as a simplification, we pull in these maps as squares. So sometimes you get these little fringes, but I think the key is that we have a continuous data layer for everywhere. And we're just part of what makes this work so quickly, because the continuous data layer is huge, is breaking it into these individual pieces. So these results are valid, and there's probably also model results out here, but we're focusing on this area here. So it's just kind of an extraneous piece there, but it does illustrate the point that if you are interested in what's happening right here, those model results exist, and we can pull them up on GIS very easily. Yeah, so probably if I really wanted to be clean about it, I'd go clean up all those pieces. For each of these polygons, there are about 28 maps. And so cut a corner and left some corners in.
Jonathan, I have a question.
Sure.
So as this, we're in phase 2 now, and as it moves forward, is it possible for, say, a community like Rye or Mamaroneck or New Rochelle to really hone in and like go right to their marshes and get a little bit more detailed? Because you mentioned that you were using like the National Wetlands Inventory. Could there be like more precise mapping of that vegetation and that modeled, or maybe what types of vegetation? Like Tracy brought up something about invasives versus natives, things like that can really fine tune the model.
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as the scope of this project goes, those maps would be super useful to have in order to provide context, in order to understand the uncertainty and the simplifications within this model. Say, well, look at all these things that are under low marsh. So when you're looking at future low marsh, you could have a similar composition of, marshes, or maybe more invasive species, because by definition, the area will have been disturbed recently, due to sea level rise. So, and the conservation plans bring in those kind of GIS results, I'd love to bring that kind of data into those. But in terms of changing the model at this point, because this project finishes this calendar year, and basically once you do that, you sort of start a whole process of, and the model doesn't really work on a species basis either. So even if we had data about the species, we couldn't make a modification to the model to do that unless we did. So that would be so the undertaking to modify the model results, I think is something we couldn't do, but to incorporate those into our interpretation of the model results and our marsh conservation planning, that would be a huge benefit.
And can you just, I know that this is probably said before, and I've probably heard it multiple times at this point, but can you just say what sources you use for the like existing footprint of the marsh?
Yeah, well, thank you. So you mean like in terms of when this polygon here about like what Pine Brook is, or in terms of,
like,
or in terms of this, yeah.
You have 2003.
Oh, right, exactly. Yes. So that is based on, it's primarily the National Wetland Inventory. Okay. But what we do is we run the National Wetland Inventory through the model, because when we want to look at a projection of 2040, 2055, like we want to get the impact of sea level rise specifically. We don't want like the model uncertainty to be incorporated in that. So there might be, for the most part, we've calibrated the model, but as, for example, if you look at this, the National Wetland Inventory polygon probably falls pretty much along this blue line. This area here that is, the National Wetland Inventory is not going to tell you that that's flooded developed. And in fact, I think that it might be a weakness in the impervious layer, because if I turn off the overlay, that doesn't look like it's impervious. I'm not exactly sure why impervious layer had that. So there is, what we really worked with was to get the model to match the National Wetland Inventory data. And when it missed, then that was a problem. So for example, these areas here, these little cells here are too small for the National Wetland Inventory to pick up. So that's definitely the model saying National Wetland Inventory says there's high marsh there, but we think there's low marsh there. And if I look at the, if I again turn that off a little bit there, I mean, is there even a marsh there that might be unvegetated? So there is some, you know, uncertainty on the 5 meter to 5 meter basis. But primarily, if the model's missing the NWI badly, then we had a problem when we fixed the model. So mostly NWI, but to be, you know, for full disclosure, it's actually the model result trying to match the NWI at that date. Yeah. All right, let's see. Thank you for the questions and the comments. Appreciated. So I have some more details about the modeling, but I think they're interesting and we might get to them, but I think I want to jump through this section, which is a little technical, and jump to this because I feel like this is really where the heart of the question is now. What we're trying to do with this process, and you know what Vicky's trying to do, and I sincerely appreciate this because I think a lot of times, as someone who's developed ecological computer models for decades now, mostly funded by policymakers, sometimes that there are certain types of models that that definitely impact public policy directly. And there are others where it seems like, you know, we produce the model and then the results sort of sit on a website and it doesn't do much. And so I think, so I appreciate Vicky's reaching out and getting this conversation started. So how can we leverage those model results, but also we can move beyond the model results if that is not an area where, you know, if that provides the context, but that's not the area we want the focus to be, what's the next step in marsh conservation planning? And so what we have over the next 3.5 months, some support is through this project is some group communication and meeting support. So setting up a time where where everyone can meet and getting these, as I said, it's really, before we did it with 3 1 to 1.5 hour meetings, where we just discussed the technical issues, and there was some work in between those meetings in terms of providing materials. We have some existing document frameworks, but we can work on making those better or different or site specific, and some additional data and analysis from what we've looked at in terms of the viewer. I guess one question that I wanted to ask going back to this is, did anybody have any thoughts about, you know, what are the potential challenges and the timeline of those challenges for the site in particular? I don't know if anybody had any feedback in terms of what the model results were telling you about Pine Brook. And I won't, you know, pause too long on that, but one of the interesting things about Pine Brook that I see is that, you know, the current marsh footprint is largely in public land, but it's very tightly constrained by that public land. I mean, the public land is very tight around it. There's not a whole lot of room for marsh to expand on public land. And when you look at where it's expanding, it's a lot of private lands that it's expanding onto. And so, you know, the two pieces that I would take from this are, first of all, fortunately, because this is high marsh, that managing the current marsh, making sure that you don't have loss there is going to be very important, because the expansion of marsh is uncertain. You know, it takes a lot of public-private partnership. So that's going to be a real challenge. And then there's going to have to be, again, you know, as we were talking about, there's going to have to be some thought about natural shorelines versus vertical seawalls. And if you look at the high sea level rise scenario, things change quite a bit. The other point that I want to make is that when you have a marsh that is a high marsh convert to a low marsh to this green color, that transition is a fairly significant ecological transition that involves probably additional salinity coming to the site, a total change of speciation, probably potential. So that transition itself from this blue color to this green color, I would think would require some management to make sure that you have a desirable outcome on those lands. Okay, but I went backwards a little bit for a minute. Yes, I see it as a question.
Hi, this is Nancy Seligson again. I am very familiar with this area, and what I see in trying to put this into action or implement something or spark action for it, some of the concerns I have are how to get this information to folks who can maybe do something with it and sparking their interest in it. I think seeing this would be very interesting to them, but I also think that offering them or providing them with guidance and suggestions of how to address some of this or plan for some of this would also be very welcome. But I think it would have to be done on such a granular level, like literally going to, making a presentation at a board meeting of the Village of Larchmont trustees or the Town of Mamaroneck board members. And I'm just wondering, if that's at all being considered, because, all of this information is so good, but if it isn't shared and embraced by those who can actually implement something, we're not going to get very far.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Angela, I feel like this echoes, what we were talking a little bit before the webinar, and it seems like it echoes a lot of what Angela was saying in terms of the importance in this next step of getting the towns involved. Because if I go back to the Westchester Marsh Conservation Group and we look at the it's a really diverse group that was our stakeholder group that helped us put this together. But there aren't any specific town government, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not seeing anything here. Immediately. So I think you're right, and I think that should be a priority of this next. If we continue to develop something like this in Westchester, maybe the thing to do would be to put together a group that is, rather than part of the reason there's no towns involved also is because this was a broad study of the marshes in Westchester. But if we want to look at one in particular, getting the town at the table.
No,
yeah.
I just
Go
want
ahead,
to follow
please.
up. I understand that, and I think it's great to have that. I just think that taking it to the next step of implementation or action, is something that we should all be thinking of. And given the resources that go into this, it would be great if we also had the resources or use some of those resources to make direct connections with the communities, because they love seeing their own stuff in writing and looked at and examined.
Right. So getting them involved, but also then presenting it back to the people who may not, be accessible is what I'm hearing. So, within this project as conceived, after this report is completed, there is a process of community outreach, and there's a community outreach meeting. Now that might be too broad still in terms of what you're talking about. So clearly the towns can be invited to those, but in terms of it's possible that we could also, if we were invited by a local board, that, I mean, I'll be happy to give a short presentation. Probably, I mean, it'd be great to do it in person, but it would probably be via Zoom at this point. I know that, yeah, would have to figure that out, those specifics, but it's certainly not outside the question that to have a direct meeting with the town could occur. But I just have to talk a little bit to Vicky and Jordan from NEIWPCC about how to set that up. I appreciate that. I'm gonna make that note.
Yeah, and Jonathan, I'll just note, I think I could follow up with you as well. Maybe Angela and I too. It'd be great to set up. I could assist with setting up those meetings. I think that would be a good idea to get the word directly to those municipalities.
Right, that makes sense. That could be part of this process of developing this cooperative group to do the planning. If it could happen sooner, if you present, we don't have to necessarily present the plan, but we can present, here's what we're working with. It could be either presenting after the 3 months of work, or we could present what we've got now and say, this is what we're working on planning for. Do you want to be part of this team?
And just to chime in, I'm noticing in the chat that Anne brought up a good point about like the local homeowners associations along the coastline of Westchester. There are a lot of those groups. So they do have a lot of input in how the properties are managed, and they do tend to manage within their little associations, beaches and little marsh areas as well. So, they have like communal places that they want to manage properly. They're good outreach effort.
Yeah, that's, I think, right. And I guess that's an interesting question too. Probably we want to do that outreach prior to working on the plan, because as much input as we can get from these groups that are making the decisions in terms of the planning. I mean, even though that might sometimes make things complicated in terms of you have different people who have different priorities, but that might make the plan also have more the potential for more traction. I see another hand.
Yeah, that's me again, Nancy.
Sure,
I
thank
was
you.
just also thinking that, every one of these communities now has an environmental committee. The one in the town of Mamaroneck is called the Sustainability Collaborative. It is possible to, include them in this kind of presentation, and it's possible that someone from those groups would like to sort of lead the effort or take it on. And that would be sort of an efficient way to do it for the community, but it definitely needs to be shared with them in a serious way. And I don't know if it came, maybe Angela, if it came from DEC, maybe that would get their attention.
Yeah, that's a common thing that I'm recognizing within, as part of my job, what I'm recognizing is that a lot of the local municipalities and these groups are looking to the DEC. So if we have private residences or private citizens that are concerned about marsh conservation in this case, but potentially other resiliency measures like flood protection, and then they're talking to their local boards, their planning boards, their zoning boards, their village trustees, it kind of swivels to, well, what does the DEC say? And we're kind of put on this spotlight, and I'm starting to realize that there's a lot of stake put on like what I might say for private properties specifically. But so yes, I do understand that. And it's hard in that from a regulatory perspective, because of my role isn't to necessarily be the end all be all of like, this is bad, or this is good, this is not going to work, this is going to work. But thankfully, within the DEC, we have different components or different programs. So while I work in a regulatory, we
Right.
also have people like Vicky who are, the habitat and restoration. I think her official title is Habitat Restoration Coordinator for the Long Island Sound Study. And we have
Yes.
people like Sarah who have been brought on through Sea Grant and the Long Island Sound Study, and is like specifically placed in Westchester to offer communities support and assistance that maybe from a regulatory perspective isn't always going to be the ideal approach. So I think if we kind of look at each other as a team and understand that within the DEC, there's teams working on different aspects of marsh conservation. So if I have to come at it from a purely regulatory view, I'm limited by what's written into law and the regulations, versus Sarah, who's capable of kind of assisting communities directly with resiliency planning and offers her own expertise from that perspective.
Yeah.
So,
No, I totally appreciate that. And I think you're right. I'm just trying to figure out how to get their attention.
yeah, I know. And you're, you know what, Nancy, you're not the first person even this month to be telling me this. I've had multiple people. I was out on site visits last week in Westchester, and we had people approaching the cars left and right. So, so I understand, and we hear what you're saying, and I do think it's important that we send out a wide cast on the webinars like today, but maybe we do need to have a more direct approach to certain community groups or municipalities, or kind of offer up opportunities for just that small group of people to kind of dig in deep and ask us questions and get our opinions, and have multiple people present from the state and the Long Island Sound Study, and Jonathan here who has his expertise in this modeling and these mappers. So we definitely hear what you're saying, and we'll take that into consideration and try to figure out some kind of approach to deal with that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think ideally what you're talking about could be, and the timeline might be a little aggressive, but that could be what we're talking about over the next 3.5 months. I think the timeline has some flexibility if there's a reason it needs to be flexed. But to get, as I mean, I think the thought here, as conceptualized, that this meeting would get a lot of the community planners and local government folks who were invited. Then once we sort of get some, let's focus on Pine Brook. Let's go in on that one. We have, these interested parties to then, in that next step, extend another set of invitations where we talk, to all the local government, the local towns, some of the homeowner groups, the board members. Just let them know what's happening, invite them to the table to be part of the conversation. Many of them won't be interested, but some will. And then, I think that's the concept of getting, these groups together where everybody has these different perspectives, seeing where there's where there's consensus and where we need to outline different approaches, or different points of view. That could be a strength of this project, and part of just getting people talking so that there is, a group that could go forward. I think that's, that's how we envision it to some extent, to the extent that's possible.
And just to add on to that, because I am regulatory, and because I am reviewing a lot of, so there's just we can have discussions about marsh management when it gets right down to it, and you're working within a marsh, or you're working in the adjacent or regulated adjacent area next to a marsh. It's going to have to come through the department, for permitting purposes. And I'm always open and available to talk to community members, whether it's just an individual who wants to understand permitting and the regulatory, or environmental committee within a community, anyone can reach out to me at any time and kind of set up a time frame. Like we could set up a date to discuss those more specific regulatory procedures and how the state regulates tidal wetlands and what's regulated and what's not regulated, because that kind of comes up a lot in these conversations. And going back to what you said about the seawalls, there's a lot happening there in the regs that can sometimes be limiting to the state, and how we can review and look at these projects. So anytime anyone on this call, I know there's quite a variety of people, but anyone in Westchester County that wants to have a discussion, feel free to contact me, and I can set up a call, a WebEx, meet on site even, and kind of deep dive into that portion of what the DEC does.
Thanks. Okay, so so in terms of like what the kind of support that we can put together, putting together a document framework, and then what we did before was that we had a lot of people provide us with an awful lot of material. Angela did some writing for us and provided us with some material. We had a big group there, put that together, but that all had to be integrated into a document that sort of was cohesive. And as I pointed out, there are some potential for some additional model results because these model results are continuous. And then if we want to talk, say, for example, about this flood mitigation, wave attenuation, moving that, finding some more of the scientific literature that supports that, which can sometimes be convincing as an argument that these ecosystems are important. So there's a lot of these are the kind of support, and some examples from the Mattatuck Creek, the Westchester document has a lot of these examples of the history, which I think was maybe even more compelling from Westchester than from Mattatuck Creek. So I'm not sure why I'm leading with this slide here, but the history of where marshes were, I feel like kind of has the potential to be educational and convincing in terms of what went previously and therefore what was lost, and the historical character of a location. In this case, in Mattatuck Creek, you can see a location down here, which was open water or wetlands, just completely became dry land, for example. So we use a lot of the historic aerial photography, historic aerial town books, just to look a little bit at the history. We bring in other data analyses. In this case, there's a marsh trends analysis from 1974 to 2005, which showed that in Mattatuck Creek that things were fairly stable. Now, in Westchester, I believe those results were not as they weren't as stable between 1974 and 2005, and that wasn't likely because of sea level rise, but was because of other factors, whether it be development or water quality issues or the like. So that kind of gives a backdrop over which we already have systems that are threatened, that are further threatened. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about public and private land ownership, and we can highlight that. And then going in on specific ecology, going into, like in this case, we were looking at specific osprey nesting sites. And we spent a little bit of time talking about, okay, so then I guess the question is, when we get to where the rubber meets the road, this section about what are the tools that we have for marsh conservation. And in the first document for Westchester County, we kind of more just discuss these as pieces that are there with some case studies, as some tools that we could use with case studies. But I think if we choose a specific site and we hone in on that site, then we have the potential to get much more specific about these. The other thing that I want to point out is that Vicky pointed out previously is that marsh restoration is a significant priority of Long Island Sound study, in their comprehensive conservation and management plan, they've committed to a restoration of additional 515 acres of tidal wetlands, which is a lot. That increases the likelihood that if a local region or a local marsh has a project where they want to look at marsh restoration, that would definitely, because it's already something that's a committed priority, increases the chance of funding there. Here's a early marsh restoration picture from Mattatuck Creek. Okay, so what I want to open to a little more discussion, although I truly appreciate everybody who's spoken up so far. This has been really fruitful. I hope we can continue to develop it. But we've already talked a little bit about the what the strengths and weaknesses of the first Westchester document. I don't know if people want to, if anybody has anything they want to add about what their impressions were, how it could be strengthened. And then another, I would be really interested to hear, because as we go through the end of this month, we're going to be working in small teams and trying to hone down. We have the resources to support 2 or 3 additional marsh conservation plans. And so if people have ideas, that we should look at about, is a specific marsh that has a specific, that already has groups around it, what sites are especially interesting or promising, both in terms of their physical characteristics and potentially the groups that are interested in working on this kind of thing. And also whether there are any pieces of a marsh conservation plan that we have missed. Okay, Katie,
Well,
go
I
ahead.
have one suggestion I was just thinking about. These plans revolve around marsh conservation, but obviously there's going to be conflicting priorities within communities, whether it's like a private residence or municipal property, like maybe public parks. And so one thing that maybe the county level Westchester plan didn't quite cover is like how to manage, how to manage a marsh and, kind of preserve it, protect it, and plan for the future, while also managing these other potentially conflicting needs. So protecting, private property and property loss, and people kind of maintaining their parcel of land without giving way.
Right, loss of recreational spaces. An awful lot of the marsh expansion is on baseball fields and golf courses, a lot, and that's obviously going to be, an issue. So no, thank you. That's good advice in terms of something that should be at a bare minimum acknowledged.
Right.
But maybe actually balanced.
Yeah, and maybe dealing, because it's always like a cost benefit. You kind of have to weigh everything out, and I think what could come of it is, if you're looking at specifically, if you zooming in and you're looking at one section of marsh, say the Pine Brook, where are areas that have less conflict and therefore should be given higher priority for protection, or can be given like a more immediate focus. And so you talk about those baseball fields and recreational fields. There's quite a few of those up and down the coastline here, and the interesting part of those is that many of those were at one time wetland that were filled. And so that might be another planning tool. Sometimes it's like, I look at these fields that flood all the time, and it to me is just, wanting to revert back to what it's supposed to be. So kind of dealing with those potentially conflicting priorities, and maybe also when you're looking at the whole picture, what did it used to be, what will it be, and what can we do kind of today to accommodate that? I don't know.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that's what I found particularly powerful about the history was just like, well, what it used to be, and just like, I think to some people, myself included, the degree of fill in some areas along the shoreline was unexpected, and I think that can be a kind of compelling piece of education. Katie Friedman, did you want to say something?
Sure, thanks so much.
Sure.
Yeah, this is great and really great discussion. So I'm with Save the Sound, and a couple things. Like, first, Angela, your point you just made about recreational fields was great. So we're actually working with a community in Queens who has a recreational field, and they've recognized that they're losing that field over time due to erosion. And it was a field built on wetlands with fill. And they actually really got the community on board to do a living shoreline project there and allow the marsh to migrate over time. Even currently, they have to move their soccer goals based on the tides. So Save the Sound is now leading that project, and we're happy to share the designs and progress with that as an example in the region. And then I also wanted to say that we received funding through the Long Island Sound Futures Fund to develop a Westchester countywide stream barrier inventory for Westchester County and the Long Island Sound watershed. And a lot of the wetlands in Westchester County are impacted by road stream crossings that are perhaps undersized. So there's issues of habitat connectivity, but also flood resiliency associated with a lot of our wetlands and streams. So as we collect data on all these different road stream crossings and identifying any barriers, we'll certainly share that with you all. And I know we had talked to Vicki about incorporating some of those findings into this viewer so that folks could see if we restore, this crossing by right sizing and expanding a culvert, for instance, we can see improved, flood resiliency and marsh connectivity and habitat. So happy to keep you all posted on that project. It's starting up this year.
Great. Yeah, thank you. We did have some information about the stream barriers and the culvert, the road crossings, but was for Suffolk County, and we did incorporate some of those into the fact sheets for those marshes, but we didn't. My recollection is that we didn't have any that were relevant in Westchester County yet, so that's going to be a big improvement. And then there's probably also, we could brainstorm better ways to incorporate them into the viewer rather than just adding it to the fact sheet, which many people probably wouldn't see because it's rather hidden. So. But that is a very significant consideration in terms of managing marshes for sea level rise, and also, right, the benefits that you get from them can potentially be significantly reduced based on undersized, stream crossings resulting in flooding, etc. So, thanks. Anything else? So. I guess one of my questions here is, I don't, probably people are a little bit shy to be like, do my site if they're, but is there a low-lying fruit where you think, okay, this is an area where the stakeholders are interested, the marshes are at risk, that, what is the best, what would be the best smaller location within Westchester to potentially try to put this kind of group together and put together a more specific plan? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, because otherwise our team's just going to try to figure it out on our own, and we might get it wrong. So even any leads would be great. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to put Tracy Storer on the spot, but we do meet monthly, Save the Sound and Rye Conservation Commission and other folks about Blind Brook and the
Okay,
wetlands
yeah.
along Blind Brook. So at our next meeting, we can certainly bring this opportunity up. Is this something that it's already funded? So it's just a matter of partners sharing information with you, or how does that
That's
work?
correct. Yes. And I mean, it's not, our funding is, it's, we have a certain number of hours to support, what I was talking about here in terms of, where is it? Sorry. This is available. Yes, this is all funded, to put together 2 or 3 additional marsh conservation plans like we did the first 2. So yeah, we're just kind of looking for partners that are interested to work with, and the right group will make a difference. But it's, the funding isn't bottomless. It's and you, as you can tell by the timeline, of it being like a 4-month period. So what we can do, we can do a lot in that time, but I don't want to promise the moon and the stars.
Can I follow up with a question about the marsh conservation document, the Westchester Marsh Conservation document?
Absolutely.
Was that widely distributed to the Sound Shore communities? I don't remember seeing it when I was in last year in office, which was 2021. And I wondered how it was promoted in any way or delivered to the communities, and if there was any follow-up from that, because that could also lead to who would be a good group to work with, although it sounds like Rye certainly is a good one. Does anyone know?
Honestly, I don't, the person to ask of that is probably Vicky, because she,
Okay.
our group kind of delivered that to her, and she is on leave. So I know there were efforts, the community outreach was part of that, which I think was, the effort was to, this part of the project here, sort of our blast was to people that we knew, policymakers, et cetera, but at that time when we did the community outreach, it was as broad of a brush as we could paint in terms of getting it out there. But then in terms of what the additional distribution or follow-up, I'm not exactly sure how that happened. I know Vicky had talked to me about some additional groups. I see that that Angela, you have your hand up, so I don't know if it's about this question.
No, not particularly. I was just gonna, there's a few things in the chat, but yeah, I'm not sure of the distribution. Katie did bring up that it was shared in our Long Island Sound Study Habitat Restoration and Stewardship Work Group. I'm not sure if the county shared it with local municipalities and groups. So yeah, maybe that is something that we should try to put in a more visible place, maybe online, as well as maybe that part of the problem might be that we just don't have the right contact information to reach those groups, right? So we might not have a list, an appropriate list for all the best contacts within a community. For example, like if we should be just reaching out to the mayor, should we be reaching out to these coastal and shoreline committees? Should we be reaching out to homeowners associations? We might not have a consolidated place where we have all that contact info. So maybe that could be added to a list of things that we should be doing internally to kind of better get this information out there.
Yes, I think you're right about the contact information. And I think it was an effort, but then also I'm sure that something like this, there's so much data and information, if you have an email contact list, how many emails do you get with new reports and interesting information coming into your inbox? So it also, we struggle just with the information age and trying to differentiate ourselves.
There are a few questions.
Yes.
So
Go ahead.
Isabel said in the chat that she would just like some time to kind of talk to her partners about priorities. So they can contact you and kind of with any maybe priorities that they think they come up with.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. I'll put you should have my email address because I sent out some emails to registered people, but I can also put, oops, I can also put my my information in the chat.
And then we had another question about, is this specific to the Long Island Sound or does the South Shore of Long Island apply? And I'm, you know, it's Long Island Sound focused, but I don't know, Jonathan, if you.
Yeah, I believe, you know, because it's funded through Long Island Sound Study, it is restricted to the currently restricted. We have data for the South Shore, so maybe in a future project, but currently it's restricted to the Long Island Sound Study domain in New York specifically. Okay, here we go. Was there any other questions from the chat?
No questions, but some suggestions. Like Glen Island may be a candidate, as you'd only be working within one entity, which is the county. It's county owned.
Okay, yeah.
And then Katie had talked about that it'd be good to kind of, when you're looking for potential groups that would like to participate in a marsh conservation plan, that it could be beneficial in the future for securing, you know, grant money. For
I agree. I think that's a really good point. And I think that, you know, that's kind of the desire here, right, would be to sort of be a catalyst for and a tool that could be used for these groups to reach out to that for that next step.
And it seems like that's what the county's approach was with theirs, more of like a, let's set a basic framework and kind of kick off.
Yeah.
You know, just have that basic plan and then take it from there. I saw that Suzette, did you have anything you wanted to add? Your hand was up at one point. She works for the county.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just would like to say, you know, I'm super excited that everyone else is looking to find some projects. That's my goal as well. I'm a landscape architect. I work for the county 25 years now. And we are going to implement a living shoreline project right at Playland. We're getting into the process. Angela, hopefully you'll be seeing some of the yeah, that's
yeah.
Okay, great. That's in the regulatory process right now.
Yep.
Second round of questions. You know, I'm working on the implementation of that now. Hopefully we'll have some construction starting in the fall. You know, that's my goal there. And that'll be just a small tidal marsh area with the implementation also of reef balls and kind of a berm structure. But yeah, I'm always looking for opportunities. I really would love to do more projects of this nature.
Great, thank you. Well, we've come to the full 2 hours, and this is I'm really appreciating all the input. I'm happy to. I won't take it personally if anybody has to leave, and if anybody else has anything they want to say or add to the chat, feel free to do that as well. I guess let's see. I think I might have. Just see if there's anything in closing here. Okay, right. The outline that we worked with previously, and we want to point out the fact that this is completely flexible, and this is something we decide upon with the group once we've figured out what our group is. But we kind of went through this process of defining a marsh resources. You look at the benefits and the threats and the options. And I feel like the areas I put in red here are the areas where we could work on more, which we didn't do as much in terms of designation of focus areas, strategies for outreach and future restoration plans, just kind of what we were talking about, you know, also like the securing of grant funding and feasibility studies and the like. So sort of next steps. Oh, and just to remind, I think I've gone through the timeline probably too many times, but the whole process will wrap up currently by July of 23. We have a little bit of flexibility, but not too much just because of the funding of the EPA grant. So if it ended up getting delayed by a month or two for a really good reason, because, you know, a group needed that delay or we needed that delay to get the group, and that'd be fine. But I think that's about the degree of flexibility that we have. And that's it. So thank you, so much for your time. I look forward to hearing from you or you hearing from me, and let's keep this project moving forward.